Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 6, the final episode of the series. I'm gonna be upfront, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this episode. On the one hand, it is the finale to one of the best, most ambitious television shows in history. And on the other hand, it's not a very good episode to conclude not a very good season of television. The episode starts with a long walk with Tyrion going through King's Landing, going through all of the destruction from the previous episode. If you had any doubt about how destructive Dany's dragon is and the actions she took in the last episode were, then those doubts are laid to rest because the entire city of King's Landing is basically ash. Tyrion sees Jon. Jon offers him some guards to help him walk through the city because Jon doesn't think it's safe for Tyrion to be walking through the city alone, which makes a lot of sense considering there are still probably people that are from the Lannister side, or just people within the population of King's Landing, that when they see the Hand of the King pin on Tyrion, or the Hand of the Queen pin on Tyrion, they're probably going to lunge out and attack him. There's also the Unsullied, who probably know already that Tyrion freed Jaime Lannister, and they might attack him, or seize him, or arrest him, or do something to him. But Tyrion walks through the city anyway, and it's perfectly fine. Tyrion goes into the Red Keep, where Jaime and Cersei dies. He walks into the pile of rubble, sees Jaime's golden hand, starts digging him out, and he finds Cersei and Jaime dead in each other's arms, and he starts crying. Now, I have to give credit where credit is due. Peter Dinklage can act the hell out of a scene where he finds his family in a pile of rubble. Unfortunately, that great acting was wasted on a scene where Tyrion found his family in a pile of rubble, which was one of the more disappointing scenes from the last episode, and it's not worth the payoff. I'm not a fan of people being crushed to death by rubble in shows and movies. In fact, when I saw that scene, my first instinct was to think of Naruto and the character of Obito supposedly being killed by being crushed by a boulder. So although I'm willing to give Peter Dinklage credit for the way he acted this scene, part of me is just laughing because it's characters being crushed by rubble. Not only do we see Tyrion walking through the ash that is now King's Landing, but we also get a long extended sequence of Jon Snow walking through the ash that is King's Landing. Now, I try not to nitpick the show for the sake of nitpicking it, but this is another long, drawn-out sequence of a character walking through King's Landing in an episode that's an hour and 20 minutes that's meant to wrap up 8 seasons of one of the most epic shows in the history of television. And I'm just not about the time management in this episode, especially when defenders of the series always defend bad creative choices by claiming there's no time to waste. There's plenty of wasted time and fat that can be trimmed from these episodes, especially in the last 2 seasons, and a long walking sequence with Jon intercut between a long walking sequence with Tyrion is one of them. There is an interesting moment where Jon spots Grey Worm executing Lannister soldiers who have already surrendered. He tries to stop them, and then the Unsullied all draw their spears as soon as Jon puts his hand on him, and then all the Northmen draw their swords, and Davos freaks out. He's like, look, we won, we don't need to fight this out. That was one of the scenes and moments of tension I actually enjoyed in this episode. I was actually expecting to see a one-on-one fight between Grey Worm and Jon from the last episode when Grey Worm threw that spear into the Lannister soldier and the Unsullied started attacking. And I thought we were going to get that here, but apparently we didn't, and Jon just keeps walking and he lets Grey Worm execute the Lannister soldiers that surrender. Now, although in a vacuum I did like this moment in the episode, in the context of Daenerys just burning King's Landing, it's kind of too on the nose and it's too much like Daenerys is the bad guy in this episode. And when you have her in the last episode burn all the civilians of King's Landing, so much so that it's literally snowing ash in the middle of the city, and then you follow that up with her soldiers executing people that have completely surrendered, you're making it so obvious and clear that Daenerys is the bad guy now that later in the episode, when Jon starts to try to defend Daenerys, it comes off as comical. Like, when I first watched this episode, there were moments I was laughing in the episode and I wasn't supposed to be laughing, and that was one of those moments. So Jon finally walks all the way up the steps to where Daenerys is about to come out. Grey Worm is already there, which, I mean, I don't like to complain about people teleporting throughout the show because I think a lot of people complain about the teleporting way too much. But we literally just saw Jon pass him on a direct path to this location, and then Grey Worm is right there. You could have just had the Unsullied executing the remaining Lannister forces in the same exact way without Grey Worm there, and then when Jon tries to stop them, they say, we get our orders directly from Grey Worm. That way, when Jon comes up and Grey Worm and him stare each other down, it's more subtle, and you're more focused on the tension between the two characters rather than just having that logical gap in your head that has to go off partially at least on rewatch if you didn't spot it the first time. But Daenerys finally emerges, the wings behind her make it one of the best shots in the entire episode, and then she comes out and she gives the Nazi speech. Seriously, if you ever take film courses or history of film courses in college, you will see a Nazi propaganda speech that is shot the exact same way as this in Game of Thrones, and that's the reason why this and the First Order speech from The Force Awakens look identical.
You freed your brother. You committed treason.
And you slaughtered his city.
After this, Tyrion finally steps up to Daenerys. Daenerys says, "You committed treason by freeing Jaime." Tyrion looks her directly in the face, says, "You burned down a whole city," and flings his hand of the kingpin down the stairs, and everybody stops. Tyrion's taken to jail, and we move on to the next sequence. Jon visits Tyrion in jail. Tyrion tries to convince Jon that it's his duty to kill Daenerys. Jon should already know that he has to kill Daenerys. They reference the Maester Aemon line about love being the death of duty, which I mentioned in my last video on reasons why Jon would have to kill Daenerys in this episode. We also have a moment where Arya sneaks up on Jon and says, "If you really think she's done executing people, you have no idea." Again, hammering a point home that Jon should already know. And honestly, I'm so sick of Arya at this point, I just want to get her out of the show. I mean, if there's ever a character that's symbolic of the fall of Game of Thrones, it's Arya Stark's character. For the first 4 seasons, she is one of the best characters in the entire show. The last 4 seasons, especially the last 2 seasons, she's one of the worst and most ruined characters in the entire show. But whatever, that might be a topic that I will cover another day. But back to the episode, Jon actually enters the throne room. Daenerys is about to touch it, and Jon stops him. This is a callback to Daenerys' vision in season 2, except instead of snow, it's ash. So it's symbolically snow because it's Jon Snow, which a lot of people picked up on in the first place when they first saw that vision, both in the books and in the show.
You are my queen. Now and always.
Daenerys starts talking to Jon like everything's perfectly fine, and Jon goes up to her, tries to talk her down. It doesn't work. He ends up killing her. And then Drogon comes. Again, credit where credit is due. It is not the performances in this episode or the performance in these last couple of seasons that are messing up the show. The problems are 100% due to the writing. This moment should have so much more emotional weight than it does. When you have one hero in the show forced into a situation where they have to kill another hero in the show who they happen to be in love with, and the moment is just kind of meh, that's a problem with the writing and an underdeveloped romance and underdeveloped character transitions. Anyway, Jon kills Daenerys. Drogon comes into the throne room, looks like he's about to burn Jon, instead melts the Iron Throne, takes Daenerys by his little dragon claw, and flies her body somewhere else. And at this point, despite my numerous problems with the episode up until this moment, the finale is fine. It's not great, but it's passable. And then Tyrion goes on trial, and we have the election, and Bran is king. And we also discover that the Unsullied, instead of killing Jon, took him prisoner.
You are not here to speak!
So the same people in the beginning of the episode that we saw murdering Lannister soldiers because they were loyal to the queen they were supposed to be loyal to, apparently decided to take Jon prisoner despite the fact that he put a knife in the heart of his queen and their queen. To give you a quick rundown, the Lords of Westeros pick Bran as their king. The North and Sansa become a separate kingdom. She becomes queen in the North. Everybody pretty much has a fan servicey ending. They negotiate a deal for Jon's life where he has to go to the Wall and serve in the new Night's Watch. Why the Night's Watch is even still a thing doesn't matter. Then Jon decides to go north of the Wall with the Wildlings, which was set up like 2 episodes ago as a thing that's possibly a thing that would happen. So, yeah. That's pretty much how the show ends. While the first half of this episode, up until the moment where Jon kills Daenerys, I think was fine, the second half of this episode was just unsatisfying. And it's not that I just hate where everybody ended up at the end of the episode. I think if that was your intended endpoint, you could have gotten there in a better way. One of my biggest problems with this show is that Jon Snow, who's supposed to be the hero of this story, has nothing to do in its final season. The reveal that he's the trueborn son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, and thus the true heir to the Iron Throne, has no impact on how any of the characters treat him, except for slightly being a thing that drives Daenerys mad. There's also no twist or clever reason on why Bran is named the King of Westeros. It's just that he knows everything because he's the Three-Eyed Raven, so they just say he would be a good king. Even though he can see the future and he allowed these events to play out the way that they did, and that's hinted at and basically stated in this episode.
If we choose you, will you wear the crown?
Why do you think I came all this way?
and nobody addresses how he just let Daenerys burn an entire city, and he didn't even bother to warn Jon that telling his sisters who his parents are would be one of the events that led up to Daenerys burning the city. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand why Bran becomes king and Jon goes north of the wall. Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, which are the books that the show is based on, are kind of a response to Lord of the Rings, which George R. R. Martin is a huge fan of. But at the end of that, Aragorn becomes king and Frodo has to go off on a different journey because he's not meant for this world. Bran, like Frodo, had the magical journey in the story. Aragorn, like Jon, has the birthright to the throne, so it makes sense from a narrative point of view for Aragorn, in this case Jon, to be the one to have to go away from the kingdoms instead of ruling. Because, again, A Song of Ice and Fire is like a response to Lord of the Rings. So I understand why that happened. I just think you get there in a better way. And the tragic thing is, all you need to really do is change up a few things in the middle of this episode, and you can get there without completely undercutting the character of Jon Snow. After Jon kills Dany and Drogon enters the throne room, you should have had the Unsullied trying to storm the throne room. Then Jon gets on the back of Drogon, the Unsullied come in, and Jon is standing over them with a dragon. Then you hear a war horn, and all of a sudden the Knights of the Vale, the Northmen, and all the other people that Varys' letters did get to come and surround the Unsullied from the rear. That way that sequence of Varys writing letters from the previous episode actually has some purpose. Now you have a stare-down between Jon Snow, Grey Worm, the Unsullied, the Dothraki, and the remaining armies of the Seven Kingdoms. But instead of them devolving into a fight, the Unsullied and the Dothraki surrender. They throw down their weapons. Then you cut to a tight shot of Jon Snow's face as he looks like he's making a decision on whether or not to accept the Dothraki and Unsullied surrender. And then you hear Jon Snow say the word Dracarys. However, instead of burning the Unsullied and Dothraki, Jon has Drogon melt the Iron Throne. Then you have Jon give a speech on how the Iron Throne has caused so much trouble in the world that they live in, and you can't really break the wheel without destroying the Iron Throne. Jon allows the Unsullied and Dothraki to leave for Essos, and then instead of Jon being completely absent when they're deciding on who a new king is, he commands the Lords of Westeros to choose a new king in his place. That way he can break the wheel and fulfill Daenerys' dream in her name, but he doesn't have to sit on the Iron Throne, and he's free to go north of the wall if that's where you want him to be at the end of the story. This way you can get to the same ending without completely making Jon Snow a pointless character. And when Sam declares the story of the events of the series A Song of Ice and Fire, that actually has more meaning because Jon will have had some significant impact on the story overall. It would also bookend Jon's story nicely. He was born as a bastard with no name, no titles, no lands. He went to the Night's Watch where he swore off having a name, title, lands, children. Then he finds out that not only was he wrong about having no birthright, name, or titles, he has the most important birthright, the most important name, the most important titles, but he decides to give it up and go north of the wall. For me, this path to the ending is so much more obvious and so much more satisfying. It's like the writers were actively trying to make Jon Snow a pointless character by going with the route that they ended up taking. But overall, the finale that we got is the one that we got, and let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. Let me know what you think about the changes I would make in the comments below. If you like this video, then show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias. This has been me talking about the final episode of Game of Thrones. Till next time.